Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about a bookshelf essential. It's another bookshelf essential episode today. Bookshelf essentials. This was an idea that the amazing David Wiley came up with on his incredible channel, and I stole it. But I'm not the only one who stole it. Steve Donahue also stole this idea, so it wasn't just me. Anyway, I stole this idea, and now I am showing off some of my bookshelf essentials as well. And a bookshelf essential is a volume that is essential to your personal library. A book that you would never ever get rid of for any reason whatsoever. And today's book that I'm going to be talking about is certainly one of those. And I think it's probably the same for a lot of readers who enjoy fantasy, and that is this book. This is The Hobbit. It's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I think came out in 1937, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong, Roger. I probably should have looked that up before I started recording, but I didn't because I'm lazy. Anyway, it's The Hobbit. The Hobbit is an amazing book. And it's also one of the first books that I ever read. And so we'll talk about why this book is essential. Of course, this book is the story of Bilbo Baggins, who goes on an adventure with a bunch of dwarves and Gandalf the Wizard. He's hired on as a burglar. The dwarves, they're, kind of gangster dwarves, and they decided they need a burglar to go steal a bunch of gold from a dragon. Poor dragon just there minding his own business, and these dwarves want to come along and steal his stuff because, this main dwarf's family, they owned the mountain at one time. Oh, well. It's not exactly like that, but, that's a fair description of the story. Anyway, Bilbo Baggins was minding his own business in the Shire. One day, Gandalf comes and brings a bunch of dwarves and hires him on as a burglar. Bilbo Baggins, of course, has no experience being a burglar, but he ends up doing a pretty good job. He's kind of a handy fellow, Bilbo. We all know this story, I think, or most of us do, because this is a beloved book. And I think, like I said, a lot of us consider this a bookshelf essential. Of course, this is the prelude to The Lord of the Rings. And so that is why I'm talking about this instead of The Lord of the Rings today. I had to talk about this first. And it's an essential to me because this was very, very important to me growing up, this book. Like I said, it's one of the first books I read. I can still remember the first 4 books I read. It was Dracula was the first adult book that I ever read. Then it was probably Planet of the Apes. Then this one was in there somewhere. And then I remember Star Wars, the novelization by Alan Dean Foster. Those were the books that I remember specifically reading, and those as being the first books that I ever read. But this one I've read most of all, probably when I was younger. I read this over and over and over again. Not in this edition. This is a newer, slightly more fancy edition than the one that I read when I was a kid. But this one's really nice because this is one of the editions that have the illustrations that J.R.R. Tolkien did himself. There's Smaug the dragon that, they go and steal all that gold from. Look at him. He's just hanging out, minding his own business on this big pile of gold. Poor fella. And this edition is just really nice just because of that. It's a nice edition. But of course, I read this first in paperback. No longer have the first edition that I read this book in. It wasn't mine. It was probably my mom's. I probably read my mom's copy of The Hobbit, I'm sure. I didn't get my own copy, I don't think, until the early 80s when I got this. Now you can tell that this has been read to death. This is not in the best shape anymore. My old paperback copy of The Hobbit. But yeah, I read this book a lot. And still, the last time I read this, which was, a year or 2 ago, I read this copy. It was interesting to revisit this story because this is a story, like I said, that I read over and over and over again when I was growing up. But then I didn't read it again for years. It had been, what, 20 years or something since I had read it. It was fun to revisit. And I appreciated how well this story just holds up. It's just such a perfectly told fantasy adventure story. Pretty simple, you know. Everybody goes to a place to do a thing, and they have adventures along the way. But it's really interesting. I remember reading this when I was a kid, and just like, I was like, what are they doing? Why are they all singing? You know, you'd have songs pop up, and then it had some pretty dark and scary moments, actually. Riddles in the dark, that whole scene where Gollum first shows up. And it got fairly serious towards the end of the story with the, gigantic battle and its aftermath and all that. Oh, did I just spoil things? Sorry, there's a gigantic battle in this book. I spoiled the ending. Sorry, everybody. I didn't tell everything that happened in the ending. I won't do that. I'm not even going to tell you whether they actually got the gold from the dragon or not. That'll just be a complete surprise to you. Anyway, The Hobbit. It's awesome. And I knew about The Hobbit before I read the book, of course, because when I was a kid, there was this cartoon of The Hobbit. And it was on television. I feel like it was on television a lot. These are the days before we even had VCRs. It was that far in the past when if you wanted to watch something on TV, you had to wait till it actually came on. But The Hobbit, it seemed like, the Hobbit cartoon seemed like that was on a lot. And that's how I first experienced The Hobbit. I love that cartoon. I even had a record album that had the sound to the cartoon, so you could just play it whenever you wanted and listen to all the cool songs, And that's how I first experienced The Hobbit. And it took me a while to get to The Lord of the Rings, actually. You would think that since I loved this book so much and since I read it so many times, that I would just jump right on to reading The Lord of the Rings. But it took me a long time to do it. I think partially it was that I was intimidated by the size of The Lord of the Rings. I mean, it wasn't just one book. It was three. It was three of them. It was a whole big thing. And I knew, because I had been told that Bilbo Baggins didn't play a huge part in it. It was Frodo. It was some guy called Frodo. Who's he? Who's Frodo? Bilbo is my man. I wanted more Bilbo, but no, I get this Frodo guy. So it actually took me a long time to read The Lord of the Rings. I probably didn't read it until I was 13, 14, something like that. And of course, then I loved it. And that is also an essential part of my library. But I can't read The Lord of the Rings, of course, without reading this first. To me, this is part of it. To me, this is the essential beginning, because this is really the beginning of that story. Even though the style that this is told in does feel different than the style that The Lord of the Rings is told in. The Lord of the Rings is much longer and more complex, whereas this one is a fairly simple story. But with great characters. The characters in this book are excellent. Characters that you never forget and you enjoy spending a lot of time with. It's a delightful adventure. And so it is certainly an essential part of my library and always will be. It's The Hobbit. I guess I'll shut up now. We'll make this a quick video today. And I'm probably going to be reading this again soon because I'm going to be reading The Lord of the Rings at some point, probably if not this year, next year. Probably we'll be revisiting it once again. Because it's The Lord of the Rings, it's Tolkien. You have to read it many times. And it's wonderful every time. This book certainly is. Okay, I'll shut up now, and I will catch you next time.